not friendly. The creature asks him to give him pieces of his body to eat. And then these are two versions of the same story that are documented in two different language groups. So one is Kotiria or Wanano, documented by Chris Stenzel, and the other version is from Hoop, that was documented by me. But if you take some time maybe later to really read these over or just glance at them now, you'll see that the storyline is very, very similar. So these are different people telling it, they're telling it in different languages, but you can see it's essentially the same story. So what happens? How does this actually lead to language contact? Well, one way of thinking about this is that if people are hearing other people tell stories or sing songs or doing meditations in one language, and then they're repeating those things in another language. So for example, Hoop speakers who go spend time in a Tucanoan community, which happens very often, they're engaged in these discourse events in the Tucanoan community. They come back to their Hoop community and they replicate the discourse. This involves a sort of replication of the themes, like we saw in the story, but it can also involve replication of structures. So here's some examples of discourse structures in the region. So here's an example from Kotiria or Wanano, East Tucanoan. And what you have is that there's evidence of head-tail-claws linkage. So it's highlighted in orange here. You can't see the colors very well. So the head-tail-claws linkage highlighted in orange. And then there's, yeah, it's okay. It doesn't matter. So you have head-tail-claws linkage. You have statements that are marked as temporally bounded or distant. So past to a perfective aspect. And that's in one of these shades of blue. And then you have evidentials as well. So these are marked together with the tensor aspect here. So you get in Tucanoan discourse, you get these categories marked regularly. Now, if we look at Hoop, you see very similar kinds of discourse strategies. So again, in the orange, you see head-tail-claws linkage. And in the purple, you see evidentiality, so reported evidentials being marked regularly. And you also see, in this case, distant past, but again, marking the event as being temporally bounded or gone in the past. And those are marked. So in Hoop traditional narrative, you get these structures very clearly. This is a pattern that you see over and over in Hoop traditional narrative in particular. If we compare this to strategies in non-Hoop languages that are outside the region, we see some different things going on with discourse. So in this example, there's really very little head-to-tail-claws linkage in Do. So this is Hoop's sister language outside of Lopez. Though you get this particle bug, meaning thus. And that's about the closest thing you get to head-tail-claws linkage to signify transitions in discourse. There's no regular marking of past at all in Do. You get at the beginning of a narrative, you'll get some sort of adverbial said long ago, but that's about it. And you do have an reported evidential in Do, as we saw very briefly, you might not remember. But it only occurs very sporadically. Okay, so what does this mean for grammar? So if we think about grammatical convergence as involving a certain level of calquing, then this might come through discourse. So do we have evidence of this actually coming through discourse? Well, it's hard to pin things specifically to particular discourse events, but there are a few examples that I think we can do that successfully. So here's one. In East Tucanoan languages, you have obligatory suffixes on verbs that fuse tense and evidentiality, or tense or sometimes arguably aspect. Something involving temporality, depending on how you analyze it, and evidentiality. So here's an example from Tucano. You get your verb final word order, which you get all over the region, and you get your suffix relating to temporality and evidentiality. In Hoop has very little, what you would call portmanteau morphology, very little fusion of values into single morphemes. And it doesn't generally fuse evidentiality with marking of temporality. Evidentials are enclitics or particles rather than suffixes. Tense marking is quite limited in Hoop, So we saw that past marker, but it's actually very optional. It's very facultative. It only occurs now and again in hoop discourse more generally. But you do have the option of marking this past tense distinction, and you do have evidential marking. So what does this mean? Well, the interesting point is that when we get into hoop traditional narratives, we find a regular pattern. We find a combination of evidentiality and this distant past tense marker that tend to occur together very regularly throughout the discourse. So almost every sentence or every other sentence will have these two markers next to each other, which, as I said, in other kinds of discourse, you don't find that combination so much. And in one dialect of hoop, you have a fusion of specifically the reported evidential marker and this distant past tense, contrasted tense marker. So the interesting thing is that this is just happening in one dialect at the moment, but in other dialects you see their juxtaposition. In other kinds of hoop discourse, you don't see the frequent juxtaposition of evidentiality and tense, but you get it all the time in this traditional narrative. And this is pretty much one of the only cases where you get morphological fusion in hoop. So I think there's a pretty, in my view, a pretty clear argument here that this fusion of evidentiality and tense that looks exactly like what you get in Tucano is being driven by the traditional narrative structure. So in other words, the discourse norms that are associated with traditional narrative are encouraging people to put these two elements together and mark them regularly through the discourse. And now we're taking on a kind of form that's looking a lot like a Tucano pattern. So that was there are a few other examples, but this one I think is relatively clear. Discourse-driven remarkabilization. Okay, so that was all I wanted to say about focusing on the Upper Voronovo region. Now I'm going to switch to the lecture for this time. Okay, so what I want to focus on in this class is Amazonia more generally. What are some of the regional patterns we see more generally, and how do those relate to what we've seen in this one area, about this area? And how does this relate to our questions about the linguistic diversity of South America, and particularly the Amazon basin? So, last time I mentioned that we have these puzzles that we're dealing with in Amazonia. We have this high genealogical diversity or genetic diversity of language families, lots of isolates, lots of small families, and large families tending to be non-contiguous rather than coherent spreads. So what's going on? Well, if you ask somebody on the street, for example, why do you have so much linguistic diversity in the Amazon? One response that you're likely to get is, well, these are small groups of people that have been relatively isolated from each other. Right? So that's sort of one obvious explanation for why you get linguistic diversity. But it seems that that answer may not quite be accurate. So we're getting a changing picture now through archaeological work of Amazonian peoples as having, so essentially a regional scale and super-ethnic character, as Alexiadis puts it, or Whitehead puts it, a pre-colonial Amerindian social organization. So in other words, a picture of pre-colonial Amazonia as actually being demographically relatively dense at least in places, and having a great deal of interaction and a great deal of a lot going on socially. So different from this picture of isolated groups. More and more evidence seems to be emerging to support this view. So the more we get deforestation, the more we see evidence of massive earthworks. So like on the upper left, these raised fields and causeways in vast areas of the Amazon basin, particularly in the southwest, but in other areas as well. And this middle picture is a kind of artist version of what that would have looked like in the past. So villages that are raised above the floodwaters, causeways above the floodwaters, a highly managed environment that is not evident, not what you would expect from small scattered bands of hunter-gatherers. Yeah.
And which is not actual anymore.
That's right. Right. So these causeways and so forth, these earthworks are no longer being produced by indigenous people. The colonial impact has been very, very strong, and so a lot of the arguments about recreating this pre-colonial past have to do with the contemporary view of small isolated bands. The argument is that part of that view is due to the trauma of contact and the effects that it had on the population. So massive demographic collapse, social collapse in a lot of situations, basically the bottom falling out of a lot of the social structures that existed. But my argument, as you'll see, is that in certain regions, like the Upper Rio Negro, we see something that we might imagine is comparable to what has been, something that we might argue has been maintained from the past. Of course, there's a lot of questions about the degree of maintenance, but the argument would be that at one time, Amazonia in general was more interactive, more demographically dense than we might imagine now. So the evidence for that comes from the earthworks. It comes from early 16th century explorers' accounts, where before a lot of the demographic collapse had taken place through epidemics that were brought, diseases that were brought by the Europeans. We have archaeological evidence of what Hegenberger calls in the Xingu region, for example, galactic polities, so urban centers that are linked together by networks of roads. So in other words, again, supporting pretty densely populated and interactive areas. We have things like Amazonian dark earth that's all over the place, and it's evidence of manipulation of the environment to be more agriculturally productive. And also, in many cases, is evidence of long-term, large-scale habitation to give rise to changes in the soil to produce these really fertile soils that are man-made. Okay, so lots of evidence coming together to support a view of a more densely populated, interactive Amazonia. So here's a kind of brief demographic history that we might put together. This is building on Mouskin's work and drawing on archaeological work that's been coming to the fore. So we could imagine that something like maybe around 12,000 years ago or so, depending on who you ask, that we would have had the initial widespread settlement of the South American continent. And then a period where you would have undergone technological developments and early expansions of groups. Around 4,000 to 500 years ago, the archaeologists argued that there was a period where there was an increase in food production and sedentism, lots of population growth, and probably around this time the spread of what we see today as these really large families like Arawakan. And then finally, from the last 500 years, we've had European invasion and colonization. So again, resulting in heavy demographic loss, social upheaval, and essentially the end of what archaeologists would argue was this large interactive complex in Amazonia. So what evidence do we have from that today, of that sort of thing today, in terms of actual contemporary ethnographic and linguistic context or information? So we've been looking at the Upper Rio Negro as what has been called a regional system, right? So we saw all of these different language groups interacting really regularly. We have trade specializations, we have intermarriage, we have ritual exchange, we have discourse being shared and cultural practice being shared around the region. If we look in the ethnographic literature and talk to people who go to those regions, there's evidence for other similar regions elsewhere in Amazonia. So again, essentially pockets where we have enough description of relatively contemporary, or not too, relatively recent, relatively contemporary social, linguistic, indigenous contexts that we can make some comparisons. Of course, one question is, are these pockets just remnants of an earlier pattern? And I'll argue that maybe they are, but we don't really know. So what do these regions all have in common? Well, some of the parallels include localized linguistic diversity. So in many cases between 4 and as much as 10 or more distinct genealogical units or language families in a given region. Lots of interaction. So something you find in many of these different places is accounts of trade specializations. Like I mentioned for the Valdez, where the explanation for why they exist doesn't appear to be simply control of resources, or differential control of resources. That there seems to be more going on relating to just cultural choice being involved in a system or a network. And many of these regions have been described as culture areas. So again, this is where you see kind of homogenization of cultural practices on various levels. What about sociolinguistic practices? Here we've got lots of discussion of multilingualism to varying degrees and in varying contexts. So something that all these regions appear to have in common is that we've got lots of multilingualism in ritual contexts in particular. So shared song repertoires in multiple languages, ritual specialists who circulate among different groups. And then the degree to which normal individuals in everyday contexts might be multilingual is more variable, but there are frequent accounts of individuals who are competent in multiple languages, but in multiple cases we find accounts of this kind of passive multilingualism, where people will normally speak one language, but are competent in more than one. And again, we see multiple references to language as an important emblem of social difference or social identity. And we actually see other accounts of linguistic exogamy, so nowhere quite as rigidly prescribed as in the Rio Negro, but in the Gran Chaco and parts of the Xingu, parts of the Gran Chaco, parts of the Xingu, we see other examples of linguistic exogamy. So, for example, Lara Cameron and Voronovo have written about linguistic exogamy in the Gran Chaco region, which of course is not considered Amazonia proper, by the way. It's kind of on the periphery, but it appears to pattern in similar ways in terms of social and linguistic context. So linguistic exogamy doesn't appear to just be a one-off in the human world. So there's just some quotes about what people are doing coming from the ethnographic materials. So this idea that language is a diacritic, it dynamizes the system as a whole. And then in Gran Chaco reports of this passive multilingualism as being fairly rigidly adhered to. So some interesting parallels. As far as the effects on the languages, again we see some parallels. So we see reports of limited lexical borrowing coming from many of these regions, and reports of diffusion in grammatical categories and structures. So again, much like what we see in the Valdez, but we're lacking a really systematic assessment of these phenomena. So what we get are kind of impressionistic accounts from people who are working with particular languages in particular regions, or in some cases very localized accounts of particular grammatical context or grammatical change in particular language and particular context, but we don't have much large-scale kind of systematic comparison. So the question here is what's going on? What are these regions? To what extent can we say there's some sort of generalizable phenomenon in Amazonia, or somewhat generalizable phenomenon, that relates to how small-scale multilingual communities have worked there in indigenous contexts, in particular in the pre-colonial past, and whether these regions are quite widely distributed and they share a lot of parallels, which would suggest that there's some generalizations that can be drawn from them. What other information do we have about the whole region? Well, one indication that we had large-scale connections going on in the Amazon Basin comes from the archaeological and historical record relating to trade networks. So there's quite a lot of historical discussion about large-scale trade networks that link big parts of the Amazon Basin. So this is one recreation of trade networks from historical documents and archaeological evidence that is in work by Hornberg and Erickson. And this is, I don't have a little inset map, but it's basically the whole northwest quadrant of the Amazon Basin. So this is a big area. So here's Peru, for example. Colombia, here's Brazil. So it's a big region. And we have some interesting evidence for other large-scale interactive networks as well that presumably have something to do with trade, but in this case, this is a map that's drawn from Arawakan ritual discourse, where it's associated with Arawakan peoples, a bit more actually widespread, that there are forms of ritual discourse that detail travels of mythic figures, of historical ancestor figures, over a huge river system, a network of rivers, to go places and deposit ancestors and end up, accounting for the population of the world, basically. And also travels of, in this case, for example, this deity or culture figure. And this is a recreation of these routes that are associated with this ritual discourse in among certain Arawakan peoples in work by Sylvia Vidal. And again, this is a whole northeast quadrant of the Amazon basin. So these routes probably have a lot to do with trade, but there's also a whole ritual and historical and mythical significance as well. So it indicates pre-colonial or in some cases continuity from pre-colonial indigenous understandings of, or we can assume pre-colonial in some cases, maybe that's a question, but evidence of long-term indigenous awareness of connected regions over really large areas in the Amazon basin. Continuity over time. How do we know that this is really, that all of this kind of connected interface is predates European arrival? All we have to go on is various clues, so archaeological evidence of trade routes, and the fact that these pockets that we can identify as regional systems, our understanding of them as regional systems rests on more traditional models that are in fact changing in light of the colonial influence. So we can imagine that these might represent a certain amount of continuity from the past. And the fact that they're so spread out also indicates that there's some sort of broader pattern here. Archaeologists suggest in excavations of pre-Columbian polities, again, that there was evidence for multiple kind of social entities that are interacting within these networks, rather than a sort of clear top-down social structure like you might get in the Incan areas of the Andes, for example. So bits and pieces of evidence from different places that there's at least been some continuity over time with respect to these regional networks. What other evidence do we have for large-scale interaction in the Amazon basin? Well, there's plenty of shared cultural stuff. So hammocks. You don't get much hammocks right in the periphery before the Andes, but pretty much everywhere else in the Amazon basin, people sleep in hammocks. You get manioc processing technology, which is not trivial. So most Amazonian peoples, again, especially toward the center and east, use bitter manioc, which it has cyanide in it. You have to go through this long process to get rid of the poison and make it edible. So it involves, you can't really see this picture, but she's using a squeezer that's part of that process, and it involves this fairly elaborate woven tube that you have to squeeze the juice out of the manioc. So lots of parallels in this technology, materially and in terms of the process. And lots of work that's been done, recent work on the spread of domesticated plant resources, like Charles Clemens' work on the peach palm indicates large-scale diffusion of some of these domesticated crops across the Amazon basin. So again, evidence for shared patterns over a large scale. Discourse and ritual culture, we also find evidence of large-scale similarities or shared features. So sacred flute complexes appear to be associated with Arawakan peoples, but are widely distributed and found in many other groups. Various discursive structures and practices, various themes in myth and cosmology, astronomy, and so on. So again, sort of like the Rio Negro complex, writ large to some degree. Again, the amount of the degree to which that's the case is in question, but there's some evidence for that. What about language? So we've got some evidence from large-scale linguistic areality. An interesting distinction here that seems to parallel us to some degree some of the cultural distinctions between things like use of hammocks and bitter manioc versus not sweet manioc. We also find some of this in the language. So there have been previous speculation, for example by Eichenwald and Dixon, that we might have an Amazonia-Andes divide. That does not really seem to be well borne out. So work by Joshua Virgil and other people working with Peter Malskin has shown that there seems to be more of a kind of east-west distinction, where there's some large-scale aerial patterns that are more eastern versus more western, but it's not a strictly Amazonian-Andes divide. Work by Lev Michael and colleagues has he's done a lot of work looking at phonological features in South America and their distribution. And one finding is that a variety of phonological features cluster across the Andes and the southern cone area and kind of filter into the west a little bit. So things like glottalized consonants and palatal laterals, small vowel inventories. And those features also broadly support a kind of east-west divide. They also are a bit more in the Andes, but definitely not a discrete divide. And really spilling out into the Chaco region in the southern cone. So what else can we say about linguistic evidence for linguistic diversity on one hand, but also contact and interaction and maybe linking this linguistic diversity or bringing it all together into a larger system. So some work that I've been doing has been looking at what we can say about lexical borrowing, what can we say about grammatical diffusion on a larger scale, rather than just having kind of localized, fairly impressionistic judgments from different areas. A project I've been working on for a number of years now has been surveying northern and northwestern Amazonian languages and collecting lexical data and grammatical data and trying to develop some comparisons with lots of caveats. There's lots of holes in the data. There's lots of places where judgments may be revisable, but the effort is to have some sort of approach at a systematic comparison. So I'll show a few of the results of that work now. So as I mentioned, we've got various reports from various regions of restrained lexical borrowing in Amazonia. So just like we saw in Rio Negro, but we see reports of this coming from elsewhere. But as I said, these tend to be relatively impressionistic. So the idea here in this study is to take standardized lists, divided into specific lexical domains, so basic vocabulary, flora, fauna vocabulary, and vocabulary relating to culture, and try to do a more controlled comparison. So again, sort of caveats. One caveat being that our historical understanding of a lot of these language families is limited, so where you have borrowing that's going on between related languages, it can be much more difficult to detect. However, we're aided by the great family diversity that exists in Amazonia. The fact that you've got lots of different families and they tend to be small helps to minimize that problem, at least to some degree. So I think in many cases we can be fairly confident that, I feel like we can be fairly confident that the general picture that emerges here is accurate, even if there are probably specific problems in terms of understanding borrowing between related languages. So just some examples of what this looks like. So here are the Navajo languages, Hoop, Yukuk, Do, and Nda. So again, the family that I work on. Two neighboring languages, Tucano and Maniwa, from the Tucanoan and Arawakan families, respectively. And some examples of lexical borrowing where, by comparison with relatives to Tucano and Maniwa, in most of these cases we can identify that these are borrowings into Navajo languages. So the fact that they don't reconstruct, so all of the red words obviously are Navajo were loans from Tucano and Voronovo. And in some cases, you can see like the word for ayahuasca, the word for coca, these are actually Voronovo. So these are all over the place. But here it appears that the direction is through Tucano and or Vaniwa into the Navajo languages. So the fact that the words don't reconstruct in Navajo, the fact that they match words in neighboring languages that in some cases do reconstruct, all of this gives us some arguments for to support borrowing and to support a certain directionality. So here are some of the results for the Navajo family specifically. So you can see basic vocabulary loans are quite low. This is looking at non-European loans. So I'll talk more later in the course about what's going on with Portuguese and colonial languages, and it's a bit of a different story. But for non-European loans, we have pretty low basic vocabulary loans. We have more going on in flora and fauna and culture terms, but you see that quite a big chunk of the loans that we do get are Voronovo. So widespread loans that occur in lots of different languages, or a variety of different languages, and are not localized to one single pairwise exchange between languages. So I think that's interesting.
What does the distinction between white and dark color mean?
So the colors, the gray is Voronovo, and then these other colors are just associated with the different semantic domains. Does that make sense? So these are all culture terms.
So just flora, fauna versus.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and then the Voronovo is just whole. So maybe it could have been a different color choice. Okay, so that's the kind of loan word density that we see in this family. We can also say something about the sources of loans. So the database is big enough with over 100 languages that we have a certain amount of ability to make inferences about the directionality, as I said. And here's what we find for the Navajo languages. So here you can see, here I've got the European loans indicated in orange, so you can see there's some variation among languages, but they're fairly high, which is, again, something I'll come back to. Then we have a certain amount that is unknown. In two of the languages, we have a good number of Tupi-Guaranian loans. In Hoop, we have some Tucanoan loans, so I mentioned that the numbers are fairly low overall for what you'd expect for that intensity of contact, but there's some there. And then in Doe and Nadub, which had more direct contact with Arawakan peoples, we have a number of Arawakan loans. So I'll just show a few diagrams of results from the survey. We don't need to spend tons of time on them. This is results of all of the Amazonian languages that were examined. So I didn't say much about methodology, but basically each word in the database for the languages that were investigated was coded for whether it was a likely loan, a probable loan, probably inherited, appears to be unique. And then the loans were quantified on the basis with respect to certainty. So those loans that were more clearly loans were weighted a bit higher than those that were doubtful, but the doubtful ones got a little bit of weight. So very brief mention of that. So here you can see basically basic vocabulary levels are very low. There's more going on in flora and fauna, and again, like we saw in the other picture, quite a number of those are Voronovo. So here, this is just broken down by language family. You can see there's some variation, but a reasonably consistent picture. The red is flora fauna, the green is culture, the blue is basic vocabulary. And here, just broken down by individual languages. So again, just to show that there's variation across the picture. Some of it has to do with particular languages that have been in particularly intense context situations, as you might expect. But one interesting finding is that in trying to work with Claire Bauer, Jane Hill, Patrick Maconville, we compared it several different regions of the world with the same standardized lists or equivalent lists in the case of flora and fauna and culture terms. And what came out of that study was that the South American languages, with respect to basic vocabulary, are very low in terms of their overall levels of lexical borrowing. The flora fauna terms and the culture terms also came out low, but not so significantly. But this picture does seem to support the general impression that we get from these localized regions that lexical borrowing is fairly limited. So again, the question of whether the patterns that we see in these specific regions might apply more generally seems to be supported here. What can we say about donor language families? So it's interesting that the major donors are these large and far-flung language families. So on one hand, this is a sort of numbers game. There's more languages involved, more contact events. So you might expect this. On the other hand, I think there's also something, clearly something to do with the fact that these languages must have exerted a certain amount of prestige. So these are the only language families that are widely spread out. They've clearly moved around and jostled people around in terms of demographics and or language change. And they are major donors. And this is also supported by the historical picture relating to trade networks and so on that suggests that, that these groups did play a major role in a lot of big trading networks, as well as just being present in a lot of places. So interestingly, you can see Arawakan languages have a lot of flora and fauna. Our donors have a lot of flora and fauna terms, also like culture terms. Tupi-Guarani is more cultural. Some of that is probably in the early post-contact era, because Tupi-Guarani languages, particularly Ningatu or Lingua Geral, was used as a colonial trade language and contact language. So not all of this is necessarily pre-colonial. Another interesting finding relates to social relations. So one point that I'll come back to is that when you look at interactions between hunter-gathering peoples and agriculturalists around the world, you tend to find a picture that's not unlike what we saw in the Valpez, and that there's a social imbalance. And it's generally the foragers, the hunter-gatherers, that have the lower end of this balance, and the agriculturalists that are socially more dominant. In many parts of the world, this has resulted in a shift at some point in the past, such that the hunter-gatherers have shifted to the languages of the agriculturalists. So for example, in Africa, we have pygmy groups that have shifted to Bantu and Ubangian languages. In the Philippines, we have Agta groups that have shifted. So some shift in the past is very, very common. But in South America, in general, it appears that the hunting and gathering groups have maintained their languages. So again, consistent with the picture that we've been seeing of language maintenance. But where lexical borrowing is concerned, there does appear to be a one-way influence. So again, much like we saw in the Valpez case, where you have Tucanoan influence going into Hoop and its sister languages, but not the other way around. So having to do with unilateral bilingualism. In Amazonia more generally, if we look at groups that are associated more with hunting and gathering, they tend to experience borrowing in, but don't appear to be the donors of any loans. So I found very, very, very few exceptions to that. So one further thing that the study looked at was Van de Verte. So Van de Verte are interesting. One point is that a lot of the loans that we do find appear to be Van de Verte, which one could speculate may have to do with the idea that these words are not associated with any single group. So maybe if there's a perception that they're kind of everybody's word, then it's not such a problem to borrow them. Again, speculation, but maybe. But the other interesting thing about the Van de Verte is that they give us some evidence for large-scale networks. So again, for large-scale kinds of interaction. So we have a specific definition that we applied for Van de Verte, so at least 4 different language families, so at least 3 different identifiable loan events. And somewhat of an arbitrary definition for those. That was what we chose. And these are just a few examples. So In fact, words for drugs and alcohol, like coca, ayahuasca, fermented beverage, are very high on the Voronovo list. So these, I guess, are very popular items. And again, we can identify in some cases a vehicle of spread. In some cases, that may be where the term originates, but in some cases, it's not clear. And on the left hand, there's these percentage signs are just to indicate that this is a kind of approximation of the etymon as it appears in the different languages. So we have a lot of, as I said, we have a lot of Voronovo in flora and fauna and culture domains, and they're widely encountered. So 3/4 of the languages surveyed had more than 5% Voronovo among their flora and fauna and culture lexicons. So there don't seem to be too many languages that have been left out of these networks, is the point. Or at least not completely left out. So I'll just show you a few maps of some of the distributions. So the colors represent different language families, and the dots represent languages in the sample where these particular one Voronovo entoma have been encountered. So here's two of our drug words. We have coca, this term for coca, and this is, you can see it's kind of centered around the upper Rio Negro region, but it's also outside it as well. Same thing with the word for one of the ayahuasca terms. So these are both examples that show the upper Rio Negro region as a specifically strong interactive network, but not circumscribed, not limited to that region. And then we have other regions that pop out as involving interactive networks involving these Voronovo. So the Caquetá-Putumayo region in southern Colombia and northern Peru. We also have Voronovo networks, but again, often with examples of these etoma appearing elsewhere as well. The northern sub-Andes, again, evidence for networks, in particular Voronovo. Some of these words, like the cricket term, there's clearly an onomatopoeic factor. We attempted to control for this in the decision about what's known or not, in terms of degree of similarity and degree of, particularly with the Voronovo, patterning of the distributions. So, but there's an element of, a somewhat questionable element related to the onomatopoeia. Some networks look really widespread. So here are a couple of networks that are in the Orinoco Guianas region, but again covering a pretty large area of northeastern Amazonia. And finally getting bigger, larger distributions across northern Amazonia, and even larger. So words for one and vulture, so these are two bird terms. And finally, certain Voronovo are very widespread. So again, supporting the idea that there's at least some interactive networks that have linked really large-scale regions. The egret heron term it's a very ritually important bird in Arawakan mythology, so that may have something to do with its importance. The parrot, certainly the feathers are really important in ritual activities. So the questions of why these things spread is a very interesting question, and it's not always easy to answer, but in some cases we do have evidence for ritual significance of these items. So one other piece of linguistic evidence for a widespread feature, there's a construction that tends to be used for the number 4 that turns out to be very widespread as well. It occasionally appears for 3 and 5, but it's usually 4, and it means something like has a sibling, has a companion. So, you can imagine if you're counting with your fingers, a lot of people in Amazonia, when they gesture for counting, they spread their fingers like this. So there's an argument from iconicity for why this would come about, but cross-linguistically this seems to be quite unusual. So in other languages of the world, we don't see many examples of words for 4 in particular, or other numerals as well, that have this meaning. But what we find in Amazonia is that language after language after language, there's this sort of apparently kind of calc term, or parallel transparent, etymologically transparent term that has something to do with companions or siblings. So here's a distribution based on a partial survey. So there are certain languages, unfortunately not marked here, that still needs to be done, but Minoan languages don't seem to have this very much, that are kind of in this gap here in the West. So there are definitely languages that don't do this. But it's very widespread, and as you can see, it cuts across a lot of different language families. The one language family that looks like there might be an argument for some reconstruction of this meaning at least is Tupi-Guarani, but it's very dubious. So it certainly appears to be a large-scale context phenomenon. So one more word about Wanderwörter. There's some interesting things here with respect to semantic domain. So certain things are more expected, so I guess growth in alcohol we might predict would be Wanderwörter. Early post-contact material objects like needles, things like that. Again, not unusual, not surprising. It seems interesting to me that birds are very high and that mammals are very low. And one reason for this is that it's actually quite common in Amazonia that so mammals are the principal animal that you hunt, of course. And it's quite common that people have taboos relating to hunting where you don't want to say the name of the animal that you're hunting. So it's very common that languages will have synonym sets for some of the major hunted animals. So that would seem like the obvious place where you would find loanwords. But in many, many cases, those synonym sets don't seem to involve a lot of obvious loans. So there's work by David Fleck, for example, on these synonym sets in Matses, and he says he just doesn't see very many loans. There are a lot of internally innovated terms. There's terms that appear cognate with other Minoan languages that look like maybe archaic terms, but not obvious loans. On the other hand, birds are really high on the Wanderwörter list. So why this is, we don't know. I think one possibility is that a lot of bird names are at least marginally onomatopoeic. And again, there might be a little bit of a confounding factor in terms of confusing loans for onomatopoeia, but as I said, we've worked hard to try to control for this. But one other possibility is that if, in fact, you have widespread attitudes limiting loans from other languages because they're identifiable as belonging to those other languages, a slightly onomatopoeic bird name could be understood as the bird's language. So sort of anybody's, available for anybody. Again, it's very speculative, but it's one possible way to explain that. Okay, so what about grammatical diffusion? This is quite tricky because in many of the regions you have a lot of languages that are small families or isolates. So the Valpes region is kind of special in that we have both Arawakan and Navajo languages that are represented both within and outside and have undergone contact. So that gives us a lot more firepower, a lot more possibilities for making arguments for contact-driven change. In regions where the relevant languages are mostly all inside the region, it's much more difficult to make a really robust argument for contact-driven change. You can just observe regional similarities. And we still need detailed descriptions for a lot of languages. So there's still lots of work to be done. But there's certain things that we can do with this. So this is just the example that I showed earlier this morning of evidentials. And this is where if you have the comparative firepower, you can make a case for contact-driven change. So in this case, as we said, the evidentials in non-Hoop languages, you can reconstruct the reported category, but the others are, in this case, we have evidence from internal reconstruction as well, that the other categories are recent. So pretty clear argument for filling in these categories due to context. So there are various kinds of methods for investigating grammatical diffusion. Lots of methods that I am still hoping to learn more about. Some are being discussed here. One approach that I've been playing around with is looking at visualizations of similarity via split tree representations. So, and here's specifically, if you put grammatical feature information into a splits tree and investigate where you get groupings, are those groupings regional or are they by language family, and where do you get mismatches between region and language family? And that's the place where I think we have a certain amount of, it gives us a certain argument for thinking about contact in a larger scale, especially when we lack, really close, fine-grained historical studies of the languages involved. So, in this study, there were over 200 grammatical features, and a wide range of languages, about 100 languages or 75 languages. If you throw everything into split tree, this is what it looks like. So not very informative, but you do see certain groupings that appear to be fairly regional. And then if you draw out certain groups of languages from that picture, you start to see things that look a little bit more interesting. So here, for example, are two different regions and some neighboring areas. So these are regions that we've already seen in the Voronovo and in the ethnographic literature, appear to be regions where there's particularly intense contact. And here we see evidence for clustering that's regional and in some cases splitting up family affiliations. So this red, everything outlined in red is Arawakan, and you can see there are some North Arawakan languages that are fairly close to each other that group together. But then there are some that are in the Caquetá-Putumayo region in southern Colombia and northern Peru that are grouped more similarly to their unrelated neighbors than they do to their sisters. And similarly, Tariana in the Valpes we've already seen has undergone a lot of Tucanoan contact, so it's no surprise that it's clustering over here. And if we look at, well, a little bit more closely, so this visualization is taking a bunch of related Arawakan languages and then putting in 3 unrelated languages from different families. So Andok is an isolate, Bora is Boran, and Manico Witoto is Witotoan. But here, those 3 languages turn out closest to the Arawakan languages that are their neighbors. So again, it seems that there's presumably some regionally relevant change in the grammatical systems. Here's one more visualization that's focusing more on the Upper Rio Negro region in the Western Guianas. And here, for example, we can see, again, Arawakan here, this time it's in green, and again, we can see the languages that are particularly involved in the Valpes contact zone are more over toward those languages. Here's the Navajo languages, so we have Nadab, which you'll recall is outside of the Upper Rio Negro, but closer to, so we've seen already in the lexicon there's some influence from Tupi. It's closer to these other Arawakan languages. So again, it's fitting more with its regional neighbors than it is with its sisters, which are over there that are more in the Valpes sphere. So here's one more visualization of the same diagram and then map onto space. You can see that there seem to be some clusterings in the grammatical features that correspond to the spatial distributions. And just quickly, a couple more examples. This is Arawakan languages. So this is work by, so on the left we have a split tree visualization that's drawn from Basic Lexicon, from work by Walker and Rivero. And there are various questions about those groupings, but you can see that there are, to some degree, they do match what is currently understood as the Arawakan family tree, but this visualization we get from the grammatical features is very different, and much less tree-like. Erickson and Dennison came up with a similar result with a different set of features. And finally, one more. This is Tupi-Guaranian, and this is from work by Erickson and Galucio, so this is not from my data set, but again, they have a similar kind of outcome. So the similarities relating to Basic Lexicon are relatively tree-like, or the visualization relating to Basic Lexicon is relatively tree-like, but the one relating to structural features is very messy and very untree-like and doesn't match the same groupings. So I think there's a lot more I'm eager to learn some more methodologies to get into it more deeply, but this is one way to look at it, and it seems to support the idea that there's been a lot of widespread grammatical, context-driven grammatical change while the lexicons, or at least the basic lexicons, have remained a bit more distinct. Okay. Any questions so far? Yeah.
So it's not a question, it's a comment, but instead of kind of looking at the way that these things cluster and then inspecting them for areas to see if it's consonant with religion, since you provided such beautiful evidence for the fact that these are cultural, archaeological, historical areas, you could maybe turn it the other way around and use this predictive areality theory proposed by Joanna Nichols and Thomas R. Bickle, which is very nice because then you can use the phylogeny and the area as predictors, right? And you can do all sorts of things. I don't think anyone has really done this yet for South America, but there's something a little bit in this vein by Harold Armstrong and Klein, I think, about rivers, like to see rivers.
Yeah.
But I think you have this really nice data.
Yeah, thanks for that. But I would like to pursue that more. Anything else? Okay. All right, so I'll switch gears just a little bit in the time that remains, and I want to talk a little bit more about the kinds of processes of contact and diversification and spread that we see emerging in this more indigenous Amazonian picture. And next time we'll talk more about the comparison between this more indigenous picture and what's happening in the colonial contexts, which I'll point out seems to be quite different. So what are some of the dynamics that we can look at? So one that we've been talking about is language maintenance, right? So if you think about the picture that we see of all of these different small language families, it looks like what we have is maintenance, a considerable amount of maintenance over time, right? So if you have lots of language families, presumably that means, if we assume that we have about a 5,000 year, more or less, view via the comparative method, and if we assume that that's been applied reasonably accurately, then we can imagine that there's been a fair amount of maintenance for some 5,000 years, which is a long time. So one thing that emerges from the comparison of the ethnographic materials and the linguistic materials is that we just don't seem to find much evidence, much clear evidence of language shift in indigenous contexts. So we see lots of evidence of maintenance, lots of mechanisms that support maintenance, but there don't seem to be a lot of cases of shift that are very clear. Presumably it happens. You would imagine, and people have argued, that the spread of families like Arawakan into different regions would have involved shift, but we just don't yet have good evidence for that. There is evidence of shift, but it tends to be on a fairly small scale, and the most interesting thing about it is that where it happens, so it's usually, for example, some subgroup of whatever. For example, there are groups of, there's a subgroup of the Sano people, which is a Tucanoan group, that is said to be Kakwa, which is one of these forest people groups. And the argument is that people in the region say, oh, those guys were really Kakwa, and they switched their language, and they switched their ethnic affiliation, and became the Sano as a small community. But this is a small group of people. It's not all of the Kakwa people. And generally what happens in these cases, to the extent that we have accounts of them, is that it involves a small group of people, and it's a full change of ethnic identity. So along the lines of people who refuse to speak anything but one language, perhaps. The idea that you change your language and you change your ethnic identity, and you say, okay, I'm no longer Kakwa, I am Desana. So it's very different from some of the other cases of language shift we have in the world, like Pygmy groups switching to Bantu, where they maintain their Pygmy identity and their Pygmy way of life, and they've switched languages. And sure, there's been other changes, but they still maintain their identity as Pygmy people. And the language is what shifted. And in Amazonia, I just have not found good evidence of that process happening. Again, I'm sure it's been there at some point, but I haven't seen it. Often, in fact, fact, what you get when you have these accounts of some group of people that has shifted, sometimes actually all it takes is one patriarch. So imagine you have one guy who comes to live in a, so for example, in the Hoop community, there's actually one family that's descended from a Doe guy, who's one of Hoop's sister languages. And this guy he ended up in that community because he was working for the river merchants a few decades ago. He ended up there, and his children are still understood as Doe because they inherited that affiliation from their father. And so now you can say, well, there's a whole group of people in this community that were Doe and are essentially Hoop or sort of somewhere in between. So all it really needs is one man, in fact, to start something like this. So sometimes some of these accounts of switches may be more complicated or maybe more localized than a whole group of people switching. Yes?
Question related to that. Trying to compare with the situation, for example, Nuba Mountains in Sudan, where we also find language shift and shift of identity. The actual piece of evidence for this phenomenon is the fact that you find clan names and communities speaking different languages. It could be Niger Congo, it could be Niger Sahara. People are aware of that. They know this other group speaks a completely different language. They're also Dividends or whatever. So they know about the names. Something similar here. People remember the clan which their ancestors belong.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a similarity here with respect to having one patriarch that ends up founding a new group within a different.
But they don't remember the clan names or the former clan names they belong to.
And sometimes we do. Yeah, and sometimes I think that's how a new clan gets established.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know what about the varieties of that have shifted to the Linguistic language?
Yes. Great. Okay, great. So there are definitely cases of shift from one indigenous language to another with maintenance of some identity, but these all seem to be colonially mediated. So Ningatu was this colonial contact language that swept into the region, and the Vare, who are Arawakan, that language is no longer spoken. They all shifted to Ningatu, and now they're all shifting to Portuguese. So you get these kinds of shifts, but all of the examples that I've been able to find have been very clearly colonially mediated, so I'll come back to that later. But anyway, so this is the cases of shift that are not colonially mediated seem to be very limited. What about diversification and spread? So again, an interesting feature of this Amazonian linguistic diversity is that the families themselves tend to be small. So that suggests that there hasn't been very much diversification. Certainly there's been some loss of languages because of the colonial impact, but all of the evidence we have about the early records suggests that the families are still small. They may have gotten a little smaller, and some of the isolates have disappeared, but they were apparently they've always been pretty small. So there are certain exceptions. One exception is where you have the big families that are discontinuous. So this suggests that there's a relationship between the diversification and the discontinuous geographic placement. And there are a couple of cases where you have diversification in situ. I think perhaps the Tucanoan case may be related to the linguistic exogamy practice and how strong it is there. That maybe that's driving some diversification. But that's a fairly unusual case within the 50-some genetic units in Amazonia. So I think that this lack of diversification suggests that there's some homogenization going on, which I would argue is consistent with the idea that there's lots of contact. So if you imagine you've got a situation where people are identifying with speakers of the same language, then you can imagine that there's motivation to obscure innovations that might arise within that group, but to amplify or at least maintain the distinctions that might already be present relating to other groups. And there's some evidence of this from the literature. So Jonathan Hill, for example, talks about with the Arawakan groups that they are minimizing linguistic differences by giving emphasis to the mutual intelligibility of widely different peculiarities. And there are lots of examples in Amazonia of speech, language communities, groups of people speaking the same language that are really widespread geographically with relatively little dialectal variation. So, surprising really in some cases given the degree of the geographic range and the relatively low dialectal variation. So one way of thinking about this might be that if you have lots of interaction, if you have people moving around, talking to each other all the time, then there might be a motivation for homogenizations with respect to groups that identify with one language, such that if an innovation arises, it's carried around and sort of, all the differences are rubbed out. Whereas those languages that are already understood as distinct, those differences are maintained. I think in the interest of time, I'll kind of skip this, but there's evidence again from the ethnographic literature that there are dialogical discourse norms. So we already saw an example in Hoop of dialogic norms, and then there's lots of examples in the ethnographic literature where, for example, Hibaron or Chicham peoples are known for having very widely distributed settlement areas. So a lot of houses with just a few people in them spread out over a large region, but there's also a tradition of lots and lots of visiting among houses. But if you arrive at a house in the middle of the forest, you have to show that you presumably want to show that you're a friend and not foe, because the outcome, if they are perceived to be an enemy, the outcome can be pretty bad. And one of the ways that they have of negotiating this is entering into these ceremonial dialogues. This is pretty much not attested anymore, unfortunately, but this is work by Mauricio Mieri from the 80s, where he was able to record a few of these ceremonial dialogues. But this used to be the norm in the past. There's other examples, so work by Laura Graham gives some really striking examples of the amount of dialogicality in discourse among the Shavante. Work by Greg Urban talks about in El Paso. There's lots of ethnographic work that really emphasizes the degree to which there's lots and lots of dialogic repetition in discourse. And it's argued that one of its functions ethnographically or socially is to help to mitigate possibly tense relations. So that's part of the anthropologist's discussion of it, is that it has a social function, but we might argue from a linguistic perspective that it has the function of helping to iron out innovations, or helping to spread innovations widely around. Okay, so I only have a few minutes left, so I want to just wrap this up. But if we get further into the ethnographic literature, I think there are more interesting things that come out that might help us understand what's going on in Amazonia. So all over the Amazon basin, ethnographers stress certain kinds of social patterns that are involved. Either the social patterns are really widespread or the ethnographers are all reading each other's stuff. Maybe both of that is involved, but I think these patterns are widespread. So one point that's raised is that different Amazonian groups tend to perceive different entities, whether these are humans or animals or spirits or even plants, as their own social units. And that each of these social units has its own perspective on the world, has its own language, has its own way of communicating amongst themselves that's then comparable to how, say, we in a given human group would communicate or perceive things or do things. That each of those groups is doing things in a way that's comparable within its own structure, but that there's a kind of disconnect between them. So the idea that just as I'm speaking English, and here we think we share English and some Russian. In the community of jaguars would all be communicating amongst themselves in jaguar language. They can understand each other just fine, but we don't understand them. And it gets more interesting than that. So kind of widespread Amazonian view is that there are whole perspectives and ways of seeing the world that are equivalently disconnected among groups, but equivalently similar across them. So Viveros de Castro has written about Animals and spirits seeing themselves as human. They see their food as human food. Vultures see the maggots and rotting meat as grilled fish, and so on. And this is a theme that comes out widely in Amazonia. I'll skip this for lack of time, but you can go back and read it if you want. This is just an example of this kind of theme in a story that the Hukta tell. So you find it all over. So here, the idea is that each social unit, whether it's human or animal or maybe even plant or spirit, has its own way of seeing the world, it has its own language, but that these are fundamentally comparable but also disconnected. So the crucial thing here is that, in addition, if you engage across these different social spheres or social worlds, it's dangerous. So there's a possibility that by engaging with the other entity's sphere, you'll be absorbed into them. So again, I'll skip this, but it has the way people talk to dogs. Sometimes they use special language to talk to dogs in order to maintain the separation between the spheres. And there are also representations of, so language plays into this as well. So in idiophones and ways that people represent language and ways that people quote speech, whether it's the speech of an animal or a spirit or whatever, or an animal, sometimes that quotation represents the speech of that group. So it's not unlike what we saw with quotations of spirits or animals or Tucano speakers, where that quotation is happening in another language. I would argue that that's not so different from if you're representing the way a bird is talking, you might use an idiophone to represent that bird's speech. So the point here is that this kind of perspective about comparable but disconnected groups can apply not only across animals and humans, but it can also apply to different human groups. And so the understanding that each group has its own language seems to fit into this worldview pretty well. Okay, so that's it. But I'll just summarize really quickly. One explanation for why Amazonia is so linguistically diverse, and why you have all of these so many small language families, could have to do with this kind of worldview of maintaining separations between groups and the role of language in this process of maintenance. Over the course of Amazonian language history, we might imagine that the early population of the continent could have involved a lot of rapid diversification. It could also have involved different unrelated languages coming in, of course, but in addition, space for diversification. But then once you have the population filling in and the interaction getting underway, the argument would be that this interaction is actually facilitating the maintenance of these different languages over time. So that's it. I guess we covered. So I guess there's maybe a minute or two for questions.
So coming back to the beginning of the lecture, I didn't quite understand. So is there an idea that these previously sedentary and agricultural societies have changed to become nomads and hunter-gatherers, or they were somehow both in the past of Amazonia, both sedentary agricultures and hunter-gatherers? So I didn't quite understand that.
Yeah, good question. So both is the short answer. I think there's good evidence that some of the hunting and gathering groups were probably always hunting and gathering focused. So I would make that argument for the Nanahook on the basis of linguistic evidence. But also from linguistic evidence, there's evidence that there's a case to be made that some groups have switched. So the Tupi Guarani Guajá, work by Bill Millay, looking at the lexicon, the historical lexicon for, taking a historical look at the lexicon for plants and domesticated plants, argues that they were probably agriculturalists that switched to hunting and gathering because of the trauma of the European contact. So I'd say both, and also caveat being that in fact in Amazonia everybody does some of everything. So there are very few, if any, people who are really only hunting and gathering, but there are definitely emphases.
Yes, and
stories that preserve sort of kind of ideas about this kind of sedentary or larger agricultural society, or is it all disappeared?
In terms of ethno-historical accounts, it's hard to say, I guess, because it's hard to gauge what the historical memory is. Certainly in the stories that I've collected, there's lots of discussion about groups dying and people dying and groups getting smaller, but that wasn't necessarily that long ago either. So there's been 500 years of successive waves of epidemics that have gradually reduced populations at different rates in different regions. So the short answer is I don't know, but it would be interesting to look into that one. I guess we're pretty much out of time, so thank you.